In World War One, this amount of people in this small village died. In fact, I think New Zealand lost more per capita in World War One than any other nation. And even now, the population of Matakana is not great. And this is a lovely memorial to them. You don't often get this. All those who died that we have the picture of. And so on. That's the thing about memorials. Historically, we've celebrated heroes, but generally faceless. That's the beauty of this here. And they still get people tooting as they go by occasionally. I'm ex-military, and I remember when I was in Korea, Busan, February, freezing cold, I had to do a remembrance service in full gear, and it was to commemorate those that had fallen in the Korean War on the Allied side, and it was very emotional. But I do not remember if any names were ever mentioned. I'm sure they were, but I just don't remember it. And that's the thing about memorial services. They're often unknown names, the unknown warrior. And that's what's great about Homer and the Iliad. He fleshes out the personalities of those that have died and gives it almost little potted biographies of them. That's what we lack when we talk about people who have fallen in the service of their country. What were their hopes, their fears and their dreams? Who were they? And often we don't know. We have no idea. And for some people, they don't care either. They just want to know numbers that have died. Quite ghoulish. But with Homer, he doesn't. He gives you little potted histories and the names. And although it's quite frequent, and you constantly have to go through people dying, each one tends to be unique. It's very well done. But the hero that is Hector, I think, deserves to be talked about. Inevitably, because I'm reading a shed load of books, little segment here before I move on to the next one, and then the next one, and eventually I'm going to come back to where I started. Homer and his Iliad, the Iliad. I've read a bit of a further now. I'm about halfway through the tale. And I wouldn't have stopped. I would have carried on, done a little bit more. But I think there's a lot to talk about, which I was talking loud in the car and at that memorial, about the aspect of the hero. In this case, the Homeric hero, as exemplified by Hector. Why in this story is Hector, who will eventually die, is explained in some detail as to his intimacy with his wife and his citizens back in Troy, and his ability with the troops. Why is that fleshed out when he's going to die? Well, because when he does die, because we have this character so well formed in our minds, it's more of a shock. At this point, more is being shown by his actions with Hector than anyone else, apart from Diomedes. And he comes across as the consummate leader. He is thankful, he is respectful, he is extremely good at what he does, is a superb fighter, and yet he's also capable of thinking of people who will be below him. And I'm convinced that with Homer, he does this because when he eventually falls, as we say, the readers, what? If you didn't know the story. So rather than just pass on and not talk about him, I thought this is worth an episode in its own right. And again, it depends if you like the Iliad. Before I start, however, it's probably worth talking about that from the Homeric point of view, and I'm not sure whether this is in fact the Greek or the Trojan point of view, how accurate is Homer with his depiction of how the gods were looked upon? It may not have been like it is in the book, but it's certainly being handed down because it's so well known and was so well favoured throughout history. It probably mirrors what the Greeks did really conceive of the gods. And in this case, nothing but interfering and inconstant. So let me just recap. The Greeks have been there 10 years and they haven't taken Troy. So they convince themselves now is the time and they push forward, and it's a bit like World War One. They get to within sight of the walls, and then the Trojans are out there to stop them, and they're fighting non-stop, and we see the heroic abilities of Diomedes and so on and so forth in the interfering of gods, and they're getting nowhere. A lot of men are dying. They're all piled up on the plain, and it's just like being in the trenches. They just cannot get forward, the Greeks. So much so that before, and it's the bit that says Ajax fights Hector, the gods, in this case Athena and Apollo, are talking things through, and they're looking down and think, what are we going to do about this lot? How are we going to get them to stop, and blah, blah, blah. And what's decided is that they will generate a duel. But how does Homer know this? Well, in a way, he puts it across that there is a character called Helenus, who is the son of Priam, the king of Troy, is the brother of Hector. And he interprets the signs, and he goes up to... who does he go to? I don't think it actually says who he goes to. He's talking aloud. He says, Priam's son Helenus was able to divine what these gods had agreed, and went straight up to his brother Hector and addressed him, and effectively said, challenge the best of the Greeks to take you on face to face in mortal combat. Your time has not yet come to die and meet your destiny. I have this from the immortal gods themselves. Because the battle's going nowhere, effectively what they're saying is, let's have a duel, and whoever wins, their side claims victory. So if the Greeks win, whoever is nominated to fight the duel with Hector, they'll claim Troy. And they've been waiting for this for 10 years. The Trojans, if they win, that's it. They keep Helen and the Greeks go off. And this is agreed to. But then we have this wonderful scene where the Greeks can't decide who's going to stand up and face Hector, because Hector is renowned. He's a bit of a guy, this fella. Not so much a Marty Sue. He's not invincible, but he's strong. And forgive me, I've got a terrible cold. We have this scene where Menelaus, never know how to pronounce that name, he's the one in charge of the Greeks. Not because he's the most powerful physical specimen, but because he's got the greater power base, more followers. He gets up and says, well, I'll do it. Well, he's yanked down, effectively told to be quiet. They do lots, let the gods decide, and it's one of the two Ajaxes that comes forward. Now, Athena and Apollo aren't watching from heaven or from Olympus. They come down onto the plain to observe firsthand, but not as gods or goddesses. They come, they've changed themselves into vultures. Not donkeys, not ravens, not starlings, vultures. Interesting that they're there at a battle where people have died. Says a lot. So Ajax steps forward. He's depicted as carrying a shield like a tower, made of bronze and 7 layers of ox hide. It's interesting that it's bronze, but not hard metal. They didn't have the ability to make full metal shields. Not for everyone. And which is why when we read that spears are thrown, they often penetrate the shields when they're put up to protect someone. You know, Homer is very deft at talking about how the shield, the spear, goes through the shield and often goes into the neck or the gorget or the eye or the head, whatever. And therefore Ajax and Hector fight, and it's back and forth. And they're trying to best each other, but it ends in stalemate. Sun goes down, it's night, and a truce is called. Nestor, who has a lot of wisdom, effectively talks about the losses. So the Greek army has suffered many heavy losses. The cruel war god has darkened the banks of the Scamander, that's a river, with the blood of our dead, whose souls have gone down to Hades. And therefore asks for a truce. But not just a truce in which they could bury the dead. That does in fact happen, but he's talking about build a defensive wall and a ditch because Greeks, he's Greek, we tried to take the city, we failed, there's a truce, but the Trojans are now on the ascendancy and they're going to try and attack us and get to the ships. We must, for the first time, build defensive works around the ships, and that is what happens. That doesn't go down well with the Trojans. So the Trojans agreed. They take their supper at their posts, and at dawn the next day, Idaeus, the Trojan herald, goes to the hollow ships, where he finds that the Greeks have in fact started to construct all of this stuff. And there's this scene about the collecting of the bodies off the field. It's really quite melancholy, beautifully done. I'll read it out. It says, "So with heavy hearts they piled up their dead on the pyre in silence, and when they had cremated them, returned to sacred Ilium." This is the Trojans. "The Greek men at arms with heavy hearts piled up their dead on the pyre, and when they cremated them, returned to their hollow ships." Again, a senseless waste of life, which I couldn't help thinking about when I did memorial services. It was done for a reason. It was to defend against an injustice of an attacker, but senseless waste of life either way. And then, because this is Homer, Poseidon, the god, is complaining to Father Zeus. "The Greeks have thrown a wall around their ships," he says, "and dug a ditch along it without offering impressive sacrifices to the gods." A slight. That has an effect, because what we then have is a chapter about Zeus being a bit of a git, as he's wont to. He effectively threatens all the gods. He says, "I've had enough of this. I'm giving you an instructions now. If you fail to follow it, I'm going to throw you into Tartarus or banish you back to Olympus." He says, "Try me if you like." He says, "I'm determined to bring this business to a speedy close. I give you my ruling, which no god or goddess must attempt to defy. You must accept it, every one of you." And they all go silent. I mean, this is tyranny. "If I find any god taking independent action and going to help the Trojans or the Greeks, he shall be thrashed." He said, "I'll teach you how far I am the most powerful of all the immortals." Athena is the one that stands up against him. And he said, "Look, we're just sad that, if you're going to allow things to happen, the Greeks are going to suffer." And in fact, what happens is Zeus has got these scales. And he puts in it the life force of men. And he decides Trojans or Greeks. And the beam rocks and it goes down on the Greek side. Therefore, the Greeks are going to suffer. I think historically, if we assume it was a real event, this is Homer explaining to his audience as to why then suddenly the Trojans started to defeat the Greeks. A couple of things before I just get to the final bit is that there's often, I've noticed, a use of three. So Homer talks about 3 bolts from Zeus. So Diomedes, when the battle commences again, wants to rush forward, and to stop him, because he wants the Greeks to suffer, he throws down thunderbolts in front of the horses of Diomedes' chariot, and he's forced to go back. 3 times he turns around, and there's 3 thunderbolts from Zeus. 3 is significant. You often get this in ancient scripture and any ancient writing. It's because it's handed down to us from the oral tradition. And if anything was spoken or mentioned 3 times, the audience knew it was important. And I've put here about the Greek gods. I've made some notes. So, for the first time I made notes. The gods are hemmed in fear of Zeus, who they call an obstinate old wretch. The men are hemmed in by the actions of the gods. Hector then comes to the fore in fighting, and he really shows his worth. And the Greeks are worried because he alone rallies the troops, despite the fact that, it was a draw with the duel. He rallies his troops enough that they start to press the Greeks badly. They get up to the defensive walls they've made and whatever. So much so that Agamemnon, on the Greek side, he stands up and says, look, the whole of you Greeks, you're no match to Hector alone. That's how powerful Hector comes across, as this powerful hero. And you get this sense of the worth of Hector. And it's very important because it's at this point that slowly Achilles begins to say, right, you need me now, don't you, Greeks? You didn't want me at first. You weren't prepared to listen to me. And they go begging to him, and he's going to come into the story, finally. I just made a few more notes to talk about. One specifically, I think, quite powerful one. The lesser one, first of all, I've written here, men boast, gods roast each other. They refuse to fight against Zeus. They must do what Zeus bids. But they're not happy about it. And the tyranny of Zeus is quite shocking, in a literal sense. But I got here, but Zeus relents at the end. There's no constancy with this guy. He suddenly turns around and goes, oh yeah, okay, I'll help the Greeks then. After saying and weighing them up that he's not going to help them. And if anyone tries to intervene, I'll stop them. Because Athena and Hera intervene. This, in fact, upsets Zeus, who then sends Iris to stop them, and who calls Athena a bitch. Unbelievable. I'll read it out. And Iris is obviously a goddess, and Athena is a goddess. And she, like a herald, is just repeating the thoughts and words of Zeus. She says, as for Hera, Zeus's wife, he is not so much hurt and angered by her. Defying him comes naturally to her. Well, they're married. But you, pointing at Athena, have gone too far, you bare-faced bitch. If you really dare to brandish that awe-inspiring spear of yours at Zeus... So Zeus, he changes like the wind, this fella. Wow. And he actually then does some foreshadowing. Homer uses the god, the supreme god, the father, to then effectively say where this tale is going. He says, for I tell you, this is Zeus, imperious Hector will give his enemies no rest till swift-footed Achilles rises up again beside the ships on the day when the Greeks in desperate straits are fighting at the very sterns of their vessels over the body of the dead Patroclus. That is divinely decreed. I'm enjoying my rereading of Iliad. It's been many years since I read it. I don't remember half of it. And I'm surprised now what I'm picking up on, which I had not picked on before. I think there must be a name for the phenomenon that when you read quickly, you don't actually take on half the stuff that you should, especially with Shakespeare and Shakespearean plays, which I'm beginning to find. And this is the same with Homer. It's obvious he's making Hector come across as being the best of all the fighters, of all the leaders. He is what it is to be. In fact, if you compare Hector with Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna questions why he should fight. Hector never does that. He's fighting because he knows that's his dharma, that's what he's expected to do. And he's very good at it. And he's prepared to run around the field exhorting the men to be defensive or to fight and to try once more, not get tired and don't get downhearted, and then he'll go back and speak tenderly to his wife and his son and blah, 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 back and forth, back and forth. You don't get that with the Greeks, mainly because there's no women there and they're not defending their city. I say no women. Briseis and others are there. They're captured women. And it's just this setting up of really the Trojans coming across as the better people. And they're starting to win. They're starting to finally push back the Greeks. They're losing a lot of men. They can't replace them. Although saying that, as the bit I've just read, they do get supplies coming in from ships, so they must have had men landing now and then. But anyway, it's all set up now to say, here's the hero Hector, and finally Achilles is needed by the Greeks and he's going to come onto the scene. And that's where the story then takes us forward, and I'll talk about that later. But I'm really enjoying Homer. And I think it's one of those many books that I'm finding it's how you approach it. I think I'm learning. Better late than never. I'm learning that you've got to go in open-minded and study it. Don't just read it. I think I have to study the text more and not assume with modern eyes what is happening, especially if it's ancient work. So yeah, very good. Ta-ta for now.